societies do not collapse in one obvious moment. They begin earlier with falling trust, fractured identity, parallel communities, and institutions that no longer feel legitimate.
They are in the midst of a perfect storm. It's not going to look like the American Civil War. It's going to be much messier than that. The fact of the matter is that multiculturalism has failed, and it has failed utterly. They are going to erupt in the first instance against their own post-national elite, whom they are going to seek to punish for having essentially betrayed them. Increasingly, people want to fight. The tinder's already there. What's waiting is the spark. I don't see a really obvious off-ramp, and I think it's probably closer than people think.
David Betz is a professor of war in the modern world in the Department of War Studies at King's College London, where he studies insurgency, civil conflict, and the way modern states hold together or start to come apart. When people hear phrases like civil war or internal conflict in the context of Britain or the wider West, I think they dismiss it. It sounds too extreme, too disconnected from normal life. But his argument is that societies do not collapse in one obvious moment. They begin earlier with falling trust, fractured identity, parallel communities, and institutions that no longer feel legitimate. Those are the kind of warning signs he believes are now appearing in parts of the West. If he is right, then the West may be misreading one of the biggest threats it faces. David, thanks for joining me today.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Pleasure. So you stated that Britain is drifting toward a form of civil war, which I think most people would still consider unthinkable. What do you think they're failing to see?
Well, I don't agree that most people think it's unthinkable, or maybe, well, most, but a lot of people increasingly think it's very thinkable. And I think the fact, the response which you've observed to the things I'm saying is a significant sign of that. A lot of people react by saying, "Look, I understand this. I felt it, but I just haven't been able to articulate it in that way." And I think what essentially they're missing is what people who are suffering from normalcy bias are missing. They're missing a sense of the gravity of their peril that comes from a lifetime expectation that one day is going to be very much like the next. Normalcy bias is a term that is drawn from essentially from crisis management, and you see it in life depending where you are on the world. I mean, if you live somewhere on the Atlantic coast of the United States, for example, and you get hurricane warnings, and you recognize, and they say, "Look, find a shelter," or "Don't leave your homes," or "Leave your home," indeed. And you get those people who say, "Well, I can ride it out. A hurricane's not that bad. Who are these weather report guys anyway?" So I think essentially what they're missing is the degree to which the aspects of society which are fundamental to its normal functioning have been undermined by a range of developments over the last 30 years. The most important being essentially the demographic alteration of Western societies through mass migration through that period, but accelerating in the present. There are other factors which have the effect of aggravating that underlying problem, right? So things like cost of living, particularly the cost in the current climate, the expected rise in cost of fuel and the like. So there's and there are also externalities that arise from the strategic context. For example, the impact of two ongoing wars, neither of which are likely to resolve in ways that are particularly advantageous to the West. So they're missing basically that they are in the midst of a perfect storm.
When we talk about civil war in the context of a modern Western country, my first impression of civil war, I'm a bit of an American Civil War buff, so I think about, neighbors, or not neighbors, but bordering states fighting one another and families divided over which side to fight, but a lot of violence. So when you use a phrase like civil war in the context of the modern day Western country, what do you actually mean by that?
Okay, it's a good question. Civil war is a very broad concept, and it embraces literally thousands of wars through human history, often, and all of which are very different from one another. Even wars of the same period often differ very much. The bottom line is what I can say for those listeners or watchers or what have you, is that it's not going to look like the American Civil War. You're not going to have two very obvious, contiguous geographic political entities with hierarchical, essentially hierarchical leadership, forming what purport to be legitimate governments, running essentially conventional uniformed armies, operating in conventional armed combat. It's going to be much messier than that. I'll get to. I'll come and explain a bit more of what that messiness, or I'll try to explain away some of that messiness. But before I get there, just say in answer to your question, what do I mean by civil war? I'm using that term in a fairly broad and inclusive academic sense to refer to any sort of war which at its outset, or in which the belligerents at its outset were under the same sovereign authority, which, if you think about it, is in that way is a very inclusive definition, but it means that there is a possibility for all kinds of variation in there, from the American Civil War through the Northern Ireland Troubles to the Latin American-style dirty wars to so on and so forth. There are many, many variations of civil war, and they all look rather different from each other, and that's to be expected because societies are very different from each other, and the ways in which they pull apart have some similarity, but each society that does pull itself apart in a civil conflict way does so in its own unique manner. Okay, as far as unpacking the messiness, I think the conflict that one is likely to see in the context of a 21st century developed state, which is in the process of moving from a democratic model of government where legitimacy is high to an increasingly autocratic or anarcho-tyrannical form of government in which legitimacy is low, which is to say, in an anocracy, we're likely to see, I think, two, I'll call them vectors of conflict, one of which and three primary belligerent agents. I'll start with the agents. The first is the post-national elite, that is that fraction of the most highly educated part of the population, which forms your state bureaucracy, the entirety of your political leadership, much of your cultural and media enterprise is essentially post-national in orientation, and more or less the top level of your business enterprise is also essentially post-national in its orientation. At lower levels of business, at local and small medium business, that is often not the case. But certainly at the top level, your top level corporate and industrialists, you're talking about people whose viewpoint is essentially post-national. There is an irony there in that these people hold national leadership positions, while at the same time they think that essentially nation states are effectively retrograde and in some ways very regrettable and awkward ways of organizing human affairs. So that's one agent. The second agent, call that your basically members of the titular nationality, or your more more precisely, the native population. This is quite electrifying, actually, to use the term native population, strangely enough, in the context of many Western states today, for reasons that relate to what I was just saying about the awkwardness with which the post-national elite regards the idea of nationhood and national interest and these sorts of things. The fact of the matter is the bulk of the population, however, does feel itself to be rooted in place. They are very definitely somewheres. Their lifestyles, their cultural, their linguistic identity, their occupations often are very rooted in place, and they feel themselves to be British or English or German or French or what have you, in ways and for them, that is can be a really profoundly meaningful part of their identity. Then there is a third group, and we'll call this the hyphenated nationality or the non-native population. These are people who may be relatively recent arrivals, but just as often are people who might be in the second or third generation, but consider themselves to be essentially some kind of hyphenated nationality. In the British context, the most obvious are things like Pakistani Britain, or for example. These are people who maintain significant affinity and derive many of their kind of their ideas about cultural identity to the homelands of their ancestors. Where we have gotten to is a point where the ability to form these three groups in one cohesive, functioning political entity called the nation state has run out of steam. There's various ways of putting this, but if I was to make it to put it very simply, the fact of the matter is that multiculturalism has failed, and it has failed utterly. This is, again, it feels like a fairly electric statement to make in the current context, but it's weirdly enough, it's also a thing which you had the likes of Angela Merkel already 15, 16 years ago, followed thereafter by David Cameron here in the UK, saying were the case. I mean, people know that multiculturalism has failed. It's not a sensible way to organize a society, and it's created a set of conditions that are frankly pretty perilous in terms of societal cohesion, which is why you hear the words societal cohesion so oftenly stated, and usually in some sense of fear of, like, how do we get this thing, because it looks pretty drastically absent. Okay, so three belligerents and then essentially two levels or vectors of conflict, both centered on the native nation-minded fraction of the population, which is still a dominant majority, although it feels that it is losing that dominant majority status, that it feels that increasingly that it is being displaced or downgraded, which is a significant driver of civil conflict. They are going to erupt in the first instance against their own post-national elite, whom they are going to seek to punish for having essentially betrayed them, which is a pretty harsh way of putting it, but it is a very common formulation, and actually, frankly, it's fairly justified. As we will get into, no doubt. But essentially, the mass is going to seek to punish its own elite for having failed to uphold its side of the vaunted social contract. The form in which that is going to take, I would expect, is something like Latin American-style dirty war, or perhaps Italy's years of lead, Northern Ireland troubles, things like that, where essentially you have chronic low-level violence, often directed by paramilitaries. Although in the current context, I would expect probably you'll see a fair bit of lone wolf style attacks. Imagine Anders Breivik kind of lone wolf actors targeting specific prominent elite figures. My guess that would probably a very likely set of target set would be noteworthy influencers, as well as things like judges, for example, is a very traditional target in this kind of dirty war. This very nasty, very intimate, very chronic form of war that has the potential to go on and on. But at any rate, that is one vector of the conflict. The second vector of conflict is essentially intertribal. It's between the native population at the point where it has become convinced of the peril of its replacement by the non-native population. After a period of assortative movement, which we're already in to some degree, but which will accelerate as violence occurs, these two agents, these two groups, will take on a more obvious geographic mappability. In the case of the UK, you're talking about certain parts where the density of certain parts of the South where the density of migration is most intense. That's if you're looking at a map, really the hottest spot is in London, within the M25 circle. Outside of that, there are bits of the Midlands and a band of medium-sized cities ranging east-west, north of the Humber River, across the middle of the country, effectively, where what will arise will be essentially non-native enclaves where the density of non-natives is great enough that they can effectively govern those places. To use the jargon, these places will, in some cases already have, become no-go zones or zones of negotiated policing. But they'll become denser and more and more separate from the overarching sovereign authority. They'll basically become their own kind of almost sovereign zones within the larger British entity, which is mostly going to be which will be spread out around the country. The important thing is when you picture these enclaves is to see that they are not contiguous. So they're separated in islands. They can be of significant size, and there might be many of them, but they're not all joined up. That leads me to take an informed guess that the strategy which will pertain in a conflict that is based on that sort of geography is likely to take the form of is likely to have a strong rural versus urban character. The idea will be to essentially to create conditions of life in those enclaves that are so intolerable that people leave voluntarily, that people leave the country voluntarily. And the tactic through which that might be achieved is effectively what is known in the literature as system disruption, but means in practice the attacking of infrastructure, essentially, primarily logistical infrastructure, which and the logic of this is fairly straightforward if you think about it. It doesn't require you don't require the Union Army or the Confederate Army to take out electrical pylons or gas compression stations or things like that. This can be done by paramilitaries with angle grinders and acetylene torches and, I don't know, fairly simple tools. Although undoubtedly some things like, explosives for demolition purposes might, but in general, much of the work of attacking infrastructure in a 21st century Western context is fairly easily accomplished with regular tools that you get at a hardware store, and that's because we have built all of this infrastructure in the context of a normally functioning society where no one would ever think about attacking a transformer station with a sledgehammer or a jerry can of petrol or something like that, because why would you, right? But it puts a lot of weight on that term, normally functioning. In an abnormally functioning society, those are very admirable targets. And they're not all that difficult to attack. I think if you just take a normal person and observe your own society and ask yourself once in a while, could I break that? You will be surprised how many times the answer is yes, you individually could. Okay, so the strategy is to create an intolerable conditions of life in these non-native dominated enclaves. The tactics employed will be system disruption, specifically infrastructural attack. The logic of this, in my view, is perfectly plausible. And I say so because in a practical sense, it doesn't require tools, for the most part, which are not essentially lying around in normal society. So they're dual purpose. They can be put to use. The second is, from the point of view of the strategic efficacy of infrastructure attack. In fact, there's lots of evidence, both from academic urban studies, where people have been talking about the intrinsic instability of the modern urban condition for 50 years, as well as through a number of demonstrative attacks that have occurred primarily in Europe over the last couple of years. So there's most recently there was an attack by a leftist group, allegedly, on the electrical transmission into Berlin in Germany, which caused a multi-day power outage with associated knock-on impact on the economy. There were a couple of other events of something like that occurring in the UK, most famously a fire at an electrical station serving Heathrow Airport, which might have been accidental, but at any rate was very clearly demonstrative of the fact that attacks on relatively small, relatively open, relatively well-known pieces of infrastructure can generate an enormous effect. There were attacks on the Paris Olympics also, again by a leftist group, if I recall correctly, but possibly it was an environmental group. Anyway, the point here is that the grievances are well articulated. The strategic narrative that kind of articulates and directs in the loosest possible interpretation of that term people's activity is pretty well developed. The strategy is perfectly plausible, and we can see some aspects of it already coming together with movement, and the tactics are frankly pretty plausible. So that's I think how it's going to look.
So there's a couple of things you brought up that are of interest to me. So when we talk about multiculturalism, that seems to be, from your view, that seems to be one of the biggest drivers of this potential bubbling conflict. But when I look at multiculturalism, I'm obviously here in Canada and North America. Multiculturalism built this continent, if you go back far enough. I mean, the Italians, the Irish, the Scottish, the Chinese, in Canada a lot. Ukrainians in the middle part of the country. I mean, there's a lot of different cultures that came here, Scots, to build this continent. And certainly were grievances between the different groups, of course, over the years, but a lot of good came out of that multiculturalism. What's different today? In a world of rising deficits, currency dilution, and market volatility, many U.S. investors are choosing to diversify their retirement accounts with assets like physical gold, silver, and even crypto. This video is sponsored by iTrust Capital, which offers a platform for Americans to hold physical gold and silver, as well as crypto, directly inside a tax-advantaged IRA. Designed around transparent pricing with clear premiums over spot and no hidden storage fees, iTrust Capital offers something that still isn't standard in the precious metals IRA space. So if you're a U.S. investor looking to learn more about owning gold, silver, or crypto inside an IRA, use the link in this video description. Americans may be eligible for a $100 funding bonus when opening and funding an account with iTrust Capital.
Well, again, not to be too pedantic, but I actually would interrogate the premise of your question. Multiculturalism as an aspect of Canadian life really isn't a main factor until the 1980s, really the late 1980s. When you think about it in practice for most people. True, of course, that is not to deny that there were waves of immigration. And one of the reasons why Europe differs from North America, Canada, and the United States in that respect is that obviously both Canada and America are countries which were, cut out of the that were constructed and had waves of immigration, sometimes a very large scale, going back into the relatively distant past of those countries. But for the most part of Canada's history, up to the middle or late 1980s, it was the two solitudes, with the often overlooked addition of the remnants of the native community. You had the English and the French, and the addition of other other nationalities, which essentially were fairly ruthlessly assimilated, with a handful of exceptions. I mean, every Canadian listener is going to be aware that there are Ukrainian Canadians, and there are places you can go in the prairies where people still eat pierogies, and sometimes they still speak their languages, and young girls and occasionally young boys wear their Hutzel suits and their red boots, and they dance in polkas and Ukrainian fashion, and that's all very, very important. We're extremely proud of them, and nobody resents the Ukrainians or think that they're particularly alien or indigestible. That last point is the key thing, right? Start a fairly ruthless, even in the Canadian context, expectation of assimilation, a fairly confident assertion on the part of what probably now is called the old stock Canadians of a kind of admittedly a bifurcated national identity, but a national identity. A fairly ambitious country, a demographic profile which was young, a country which saw itself as having great potential, and so on. So was and part of the reason that it could pursue this attitude of assimilation was because it felt confident in itself and it believed in itself. Thirdly, none of these new groups were preying on the rest of the population. There's no part of Canadian history which has involved the industrial scale rape. Well, no, it's better described as the industrial scale sexual torture and enslavement of young women of the titular nationality for racial reasons. which has occurred and is occurring, which has occurred in the UK and probably still is occurring. And that's, I'll use the metaphor, but which is strong, but I don't think too strong. It's a nuclear weapon.
Mm.
It wipes out the potential for societal cohesion, and everyone knows it, which is why the government is so desperate to restrict access to information, to court transcripts, to full detailed examination of exactly the scale and dreadfulness of what was done and is probably still happening, and was allowed to happen with the connivance of the state authorities in the form of social workers, in the form of local governments, or in fact governments of all levels, at the very least looked away from a situation that they knew was occurring and involved police. So basically, I don't quite agree with the premise of your question, and I don't think that the situation which pertained in Canada or elsewhere in the world, which we might talk about with the arrival of migrants from other places, really is comparable to what is occurring now. That's without even getting into the fact to the matter of the cultural distance, which is a factor also, right? Clearly there are linguistic differences between the Anglo, the French, and arrivals from Ukraine or Poland, Germany, Italy, what have you. But there was a much more bridgeable cultural distance than seems to be the case in. Sorry, I don't mean to waffle. Than is the case between the existing native population and the new arrivals, which have their own very deeply held identity, their own ambitions, their own cultural ambitions, and their own deeply held ideas about the way society should be organized. And some of these ideas are simply not compatible, which means that your multicultural project really doesn't have a chance.
Sounds to me like a lot of it, or at least the wedge, because you mentioned a lot of European countries and Germans and so forth integrated, and Italians, and so over time, a lot of it stems probably from religious similarities. No.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
I think you. I don't mean to. I don't want to oversimplify, and I'm sorry. I know that some people will criticize this inevitably, but I don't mean to suggest that there are not significant differences between some of these groups, and at certain points in our history, the difference, say, between Catholics and Protestants or Orthodox was quite great, but the situation is rather. But ultimately, those particular cleavages were bridgeable, whereas the ones which pertain now, particularly throughout Western Europe, do not seem very bridgeable. And I say that because one of the things that is most alarming about the studies of relative integration or assimilation of migrant populations into Western Europe is that the degrees of stated alienation from the host country are are actually higher in second and third generations
Hmm.
than in the first generation. So it's not just that you have a a, a, a cleavage, which uh, is natural, uh, but might be bridged, but you have a cleavage which is not being bridged and seems in fact to be widening. Um, and that's where we are.
Yeah.
That's very that's not comparable to um, some
Yeah.
of the 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 original premise of your uh, observation of your original question.
Hmm.
Um, and I also I haven't mentioned scale either. I mean, we're talking
Mm.
about levels of
Yeah.
migration that which in just simply in terms of scale are also non-comparable. Even
Hmm.
with, in the case of Canada, the very large waves, say, of Ukrainians, it was it was not on the order, say, in terms of the overall percentage of the population, anywhere close to the current um, levels of net migration in both into Canada as well as practically everywhere in Western Europe. So the scale is off the charts. The
Yeah.
differences are harder to bridge. The track record of assimilation does not give cause for comfort either.
And the speed at which it's occurred too, especially of late in recent years, is historic. So I think the scale and the speed is definitely important. So there's something you mentioned earlier too about post-nationalism. So this is one that grinds my gears because obviously I'm a proud Canadian. I think what we've built as a Western civilization, and the West as a whole, is remarkable. And when I hear leaders, we had a leader, Trudeau, who, upon being elected, told the media that Canada was the first post-nationalist state. And that bugged me a lot because I think whatever country you reside in, you should be proud of it. Your roots should be there. It can't just be treated as an airport. Um, it bothers me. And I see that a lot with leadership throughout the West. They don't want to be they don't seem to be proud of waving the flag, but then when there's a crisis, the first thing that leadership does is we need to rally together as Team Canada or Team England or whatever it is. So they use it when it's convenient, but it seems to me they don't believe in it. They're ashamed of it. Why is that so common amongst leadership of Western countries that they are afraid or don't like nationalism? I don't understand that.
We could spend hours
Hmm.
talking about this. We don't have hours, so I'll give you a short answer, which I hope is somewhat satisfactory. First off, you're entirely right to be angry at Trudeau for saying that. How dare the lowly prime minister of a country say that about the national identity of that country? Does he fundamentally misunderstood and probably continues to misunderstand his role. His job is to be the captain of that ship, right? I know he's not a conservative, right? He's a liberal,
Hmm.
but a basic idea of conservatism is that there is a continuing kind of contract between the present, the past, and the future. And you are right that you're obliged, though you in the present have received certain things from your ancestors, and you are obliged to pass those on. As a result of which, and as a result of this continuing feeling of obligation to pass on one's assets in the largest sense, by which I mean not just your house, your goods, your money, whatever, but your cultural assets. your accomplishments, your ideas, your language, your literature, these sorts of things. In doing so over a period of time, you build up a nation which is historically persistent, right? So there is a connection which is meaningful. I don't know where you're located in Canada, but there's a connection.
Calgary.
All right. So, but there's a connection between you in Calgary in 2026 and whichever of your ancestors rocked up there or was there in 1926, despite the fact that there have been many, many changes in the country and in, and in the ways of life since that time, you still are part of a continuing kind of national cultural entity called Canadian. Basically Trudeau was saying, well, we don't need to keep doing that. We don't need to keep doing that. We're going to turn ourselves into the premier inn of countries, which means that at any given time, depending on who's staying in this hotel, that will be the character, that will be the identity of the country. That is not a country. Mm-hmm. That conforms with no definition of country that I recognize. What it conforms with is a worldview that people are interchangeable, fundamentally that people are interchangeable, that people's nationality is essentially related to which passport they hold, and which passport they hold is important because it's a tax locator. The sort of person who looks at a country essentially the way in which a bank manager looks at a balance sheet. This is basically a set of inputs and a set of, a running digit of, the assets and debts. But is more or less indifferent to the non-material, non-monetary elements of what make up a country and a people. How does this attitude come into being? It's a crazy attitude. I think it's a terminal attitude. It doesn't work, and it is in the process of imploding in a very serious and unpleasant way, or a very serious and soon to be highly unpleasant way. It comes into being, I think, because in some sense it's an expression of the larger idea of modernity, which said basically we can create utopia on Earth. We don't need God to do this. We can do it through the kind of rational application of science, economics, the science of politics, also. And that is an idea kicks off, let's say a couple of hundred years ago, a little more, 250 years ago and change. You get the world wars. That convinces a lot of elites that this is a bad idea, right? What has the effort to produce utopia on Earth produced? Well, the First World War, the slaughtering of half a generation of young men, the destruction of a number of the largest European empires, and then the Holocaust and the invention of the atomic bomb. This is not a good record. As a result of which, you get another reaction to these developments, which attempts to preserve some elements of modernity, particularly the ability of modern systems to generate material well-being, basically to generate stuff, but is at the same time tries to dispense with the nation state on account of their belief that the nation state, that nationalism led to those particular disasters. So you get these set of attitudes developing over a long time that become that produce these new elites, right? So by the time you get to Justin Trudeau, as an example, you have a man who really was raised from birth, has been steeped in these ideas, and has belonged to an anywhere class, which has mobile wealth that could basically do well anywhere, that had this kind of that basically considered themselves to be the kind of cliched global citizens. On the other hand, they're also part of this national enterprise, and in case of the Justin Trudeau being the son of one of the most famous of the 20th century prime ministers, a place, a kind of obvious Canadian political celebrity. And being a politician, they make use of the tools available to them. They're perfectly, as you point out, they're perfectly willing to invoke patriotism, this kind of, what is the Canadian thing? The elbows out hockey kind of thing. Yeah. They're perfectly willing to invoke these ideas when it's politically useful, but they don't believe them. It's purely functional and opportunistic.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So,
and then you get your current prime minister, right, who is almost a kind of globalist poster child, right? 3 passports, 4 passports, I don't know. He's certainly got a passport collection. I don't blame him. I've got 2 passports, I'm fine. But spent, as far as I understand, lived in, has a home in New York State, has a European passport.
Yeah.
Irish passport, I think it might be.
Yeah.
Governor of the Bank of England, Goldman
Sachs, Bank of Canada.
Goldman Sachs banker. Yeah. He'll switch on whatever identity he needs to for the purposes, but fundamentally, he's a man of anywhere.
Mm-hmm. So jumping back, because obviously you're in London, let's get back to Britain, kind of the home turf. We've talked about how this civil war potential is bubbling close to surface now. What are the clearest kind of signs that you think are visible in Britain today that tell you this risk is close and not theoretical of a civil war? What are some of the recent signs that you've seen in society?
In a world of rising deficits, currency dilution, and market volatility, many U.S. investors are choosing to diversify their retirement accounts with assets like physical gold, silver, and even crypto. This video is sponsored by iTrust Capital, which offers a platform for Americans to hold physical gold and silver, as well as crypto, directly inside a tax-advantaged IRA. Designed around transparent pricing with clear premiums over spot and no hidden storage fees, iTrust Capital offers something that still isn't standard in the precious metals IRA space. So if you're a U.S. investor looking to learn more about owning gold, silver, or crypto inside an IRA, use the link in this video description. Americans may be eligible for a $100 funding bonus when opening and funding an account with iTrust Capital.
Well, there are a whole lot of signs, and to spare you a long list, I'll just pick a few. So, starting with an old standard, which is just straight up opinion polling, right? So when you just go around and you ask people what they think on the matter of, do you think there's going to be a civil war, or right? What is your you get an answer that about 30% of the country, a third of the country thinks that is likely or very likely. when you ask people, what is your, when 60% of respondents to a very reputable poll agree with the statement that the condition of that the country is in a dire state, or rather 80% agree that the country is in a dire state and 60% agree that it can only get worse. These are some significant numbers. When the dominant, the most commonly stated political attitude is neither left nor right in orientation, but is the belief that voting doesn't matter. That is an expression of essentially a loss of faith, a loss of belief in the legitimacy of the system. A majority of the population now thinks that essentially, or not necessarily a majority, but the single largest political attitude in the country is that voting doesn't matter. And that, unfortunately, is not just apathetic or cynical. It's worse because it's actually true. And this is well confirmed by academic research on what happens in situations where there is contradiction in policy preference between elite and street, as it were. And the fact of the matter is it's 100% elite. Elites always win when there's contradiction. So there's a bunch of polling evidence. There are also things that are maybe not so obvious, but are, in my view, really important. One thing I've kind of hinted at earlier with when I was talking about a series of indicative infrastructure attacks, which were demonstrative of the potential for those kinds of things to occur. I think one of the really more interesting developments here in the UK is something called the Blade Runners movement. The Blade Runners are a group. It's hard to describe what they are because there's not actually a lot of information, direct information on them. But essentially what it's a grassroots movement of people who are involved in the destruction of ULEZ cameras. ULEZ refers to the ultra low emission zone, which is a series of cameras essentially around the city, which record vehicle traffic and automatically issue. Basically, you have to pay this ULEZ fee to operate a vehicle in the confines of the city.
Like
and
a
if you
toll.
don't, then it's like a toll, but basically you have to pay it or you get a fine. Okay, and that's enforced by cameras. And what the Blade Runners, and of course, this is very unpopular, particularly if you're a working class person who's whose occupation requires you to drive a vehicle to the homes of your clients, where you fix their broken toilet or their roof or whatever it might be, and you're paying these fees on a daily basis. But generally, it's a very unpopular measure. So this grassroots movement came together essentially to slay these cameras. At current, the last time I looked, which admittedly was about 18 months or even 2 years ago, I think they had taken down about 2,500 cameras.
Wow.
Yeah, a lot. This is a very respectable percentage of the total number of cameras. In the course of which, again, my data is a little elderly, but as of 18 months ago, I think there had been one arrest. Despite the intense efforts of the Metropolitan Police to pin these guys down, which rather suggests that you have a network of people involved in a collective enterprise which goes beyond the law, which is essentially politically motivated, that are self-organizing in a grassroots manner without any apparent leadership to conduct these activities. Now, they're not, they are breaking stuff. And the truth of the matter is, one of the reasons that few of them have been caught is that these cameras are very unpopular. So if you're on the streets cutting one down, probably a normal person is not going to call the police on you.
Right.
They might point a camera at you or shake your hand or pat your back or what have you, but they're unlikely to call the police. So I think that that is symbolic in lots of respects of the potential for self-organization of activities which are unlawful. So these people are, by definition, are moving beyond the law. So they're no longer a kind of normal social movement in that sense. It's sustained, it's organized, and it's effective, which implies all kinds of things about the numbers of people involved, the degree to their degree of organization, and the degree of trust which must exist in that network if it's able to continue to do this without people grassing each other up. Another really significant development in my view is related, and that is the raise the colors or raise the flag movements, which was at a height which emerged about a year ago, a little bit further back, but not so long ago, reached a height and then has kind of diminished, but is about to come back in a serious way. And essentially, this is important because for a number of reasons. First, it's another collective social movement activity in which people are in this case, they're not really going beyond the law. Is ambiguous and in any even if it is slightly beyond the law, it's very, very slightly and trivially beyond the law. So it's important as clearly an anti-status quo social movement, which is conducting a communal activity in order to deliver a fairly obvious political message to its elite. It's really not a complicated message. When you put up your national flag, whether it's the Union flag or the English flag, what you're saying is, we exist, we intend to continue to exist, this is our land. Yeah, and you're physically demarcating it. Those are actually frightening statements in the current climate because it is essentially a premise that all of those are debatable in the current political climate. The mass is essentially saying things which are at the very least worrisome to. I'm soft-soaping it. These are controversial statements in the context of a society, of a progressive society, which assumes that its whole point is to reduce these very specific ideas specifically about white British national identity. Mm-hmm. Now, what's happening when people organize in groups like that is that, you begin to develop lists of people who are potential activists. So they're natural supporters. This doesn't mean they're prepared to do anything, but they're prepared to do something, right? They're also now accessible. So you've got an email distribution list. You might have, in the case, say of Manchester or Birmingham, you might have 3,000 or 4,000 people on said list with contact details. You also get people in fairly large number participating in communal anti-status quo activities that are fairly banal, right? But do require them to show up to see other human beings whom they didn't know in person before, and in which context they can do the main thing humans want to do when they communicate, which is access body language. So if you're in a situation where you're trying to organize a serious anti-status quo movement, the things you need really is to start to identify who are the super angry people and to build trusted networks between people who are prepared to go further. Yeah. And I think that's the important thing that's happening when you move from from online anti-status quo activity, which isn't might be annoying, but actually isn't very threatening, to offline. And the offline, then a lot more occurs because it's possible to build trusted networks. It's possible to find true adherents, and they almost emerge naturally, frankly. The final developments. So I think those two movements, people are aware of them, but I don't know that they're aware of why they are important. And I hope, having heard what I just said, they better understand why that they are important. And I guess the last thing I would say in terms of things that are happening are I could go on, but I feel in closing that we should talk a bit about externalities. And here you have two really big developments that will have significant domestic impact. And basically, it's the two ongoing wars and the way in which they happen to aggravate the underlying economic condition. So the Ukraine, in the case of Western Europe, the Ukraine war has effectively turned off Europe's cheap energy supply. Its replacement, or quasi-replacement, with a combination of American energy and Gulf energy are both also probably in the latter is currently inaccessible and may potentially be effectively permanently inaccessible. And the increasing distance politically, diplomatically, militarily, in every way between Europe and the United States is also a worry, because it raises question whether we will have access to overpriced American energy. Which means that the financial conditions in Europe are really, really dire. Mm-hmm. Which means that it's going to be increasingly difficult to buy people off. So existing social cleavages, which in the past could be papered over with money, we will run out of the ability to do that. The second externality with respect to Ukraine is, ultimately that war is going to end. It's very likely not going to end. It's not going to end in a pretty way. Ukraine is going to be a dubiously viable state that is armed to the teeth, full of people who are very angry, who possibly can't remain in the country, who are heavily armed and very experienced. And we will have a competitor / opponent in the form of Russia, which probably will feel a great inclination to return the favor in kind. In short, we've created Afghanistan 2.0 on the border of the Schengen area, and if anybody's concerned in the case of Civil War 2.0, if we can call it that, actually is not a very good label for it, but the oncoming Civil War, if anybody's concerned about the potential for access to relatively high, some quite high-grade military weaponry techniques, people who can use them, they shouldn't be. It's not far away. It's all in the Schengen area. You can get it.
Wow. So it sounds to me like, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but, we're kind of past the point of no return, at least certain areas of Europe. What would have to change for Britain, for example, to avoid this path of civil war? Or put a different way, what would you have to see emerge in British society that would change your thesis that it's headed toward a civil war?
You'd have to have a political leadership that had the will and ability to undertake at very rapid speed a series of conservative reforms that are basically unprecedented in their scale.
Give me some examples.
Well, you're talking about since 2012, which I pick as the date because it's the date that a really important book called Exodus was published in the UK, which was a very erudite scholarly study of the impact of mass migration on both sending and receiving countries, written by a British scholar named Paul Collier, who is both a very extremely reputable and very important in both the Civil Wars literature and in the development literature. And he argued that mass migration don't do it, right, because it has a bad effect both on sending and receiving countries. What happened? We added something around 12 million people to the country. That's imagine the scale of that reversal. Yeah.
I
mean, what sort of normal political system do you think could produce? It's a rhetorical question. Maybe you have an answer, but I don't mean it for you.
Yeah, no, I understand.
I mean you to pause and think, I don't see how this can happen within the existing political system. And that is my conclusion, that the existing political system is too ill to cure itself, and it's also too slow, although to some extent it does apprehend the situation and is changing its behavior. It's far too slow to catch up with people's expectation of the pace and scale of necessary reform. On either side, people want to fight. You don't have to, increasingly people want to fight. There are lots and lots of indicators around that belief, whether you're looking at things like measures of affective polarization, which is a description of a form of polarization where people feel ever stronger antipathy to outgroups. This is, rapidly accelerating, very sort of an aspect of society which is frequently polled and relatively easy to take some kind of quantified guess at. So measures like that rather suggest that polarization is already in the extreme. And maybe I'll conclude, people are usually impressed by numbers. They're more impressed by numbers than words. I think they're wrong in that, but anyway, they are. There was a poll done by a UK outfit called More in Common, which is not a right-wing group, as you might guess from the name.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a report called Shattered Britain, in which they related this finding, which was that of Britons in the age group 18 to 34, I think it was, or 18 to 35, 60% agreed with the statement that they supported some sort of hostile activism in order to drive change.
Wow.
17% of people in that group approved of violence to drive change. If you're wondering what that total number represents in terms of numbers of human bodies, if you accept the census figures of how many people there are in the country in that age group, it comes to about 2.25 million people who respond that they are prepared to contemplate violence. This shouldn't be surprising. After all, just was it last week or 10 days ago, um, uh, three guys, yet unnamed, decided it was a good thing to set 4 London ambulances on fire because they happened to have been funded by the Jewish community. This is a fairly obvious sign of factionalism and indeed of militancy, which is the next door, the room next door to civil war. So you're already seeing bits of this emerging. Finally, just to on one final number out of that Shattered Britain report was that 38% of respondents to this poll agreed with the statement, when I think about the political and social institutions of this country, I can't help but think, burn it all down. And you might, if you're an optimist, you might say, well, okay, that's good. 62% of the country don't want to burn it all down. But you'd have to be a really foolish optimist to think that that's a good number to have. In fact, in insurgency theory, which it's a disaster, an insurgency theory is kind of centered on the idea that if you can get 2% of the population, let alone 4% or even 4% of the population in the active burn it all down category, that's an outright insurgent victory. I mean, it's game over. You end the simulation at that point, if it's a simulation. In which light, those are not comforting numbers.
No. Last question, David. Kind of dual pronged. How far out is this form of civil war that you're talking about? Number one. And number two, in the Western world, which country do you think is most likely to break out into a civil war first? Is it Britain?
That's good. Those are good questions. And look, I don't have a crystal ball, and I'm not pretending. I'm not pretending otherwise. But you asked the question, and I'll try. I'll give you an answer for what it's worth. I just want to caveat it a bit. Bottom line is, as for when, I think it could happen. The problem is, it could happen anytime. The tinder's already there. What's waiting is the spark. I feel very confident that a spark will occur. As far as the tinder is concerned, there's really not even any debate. It's all just lying around. I mean, basically, there's so much of it lying around, you practically trip over it. So it could be tomorrow, it could be next week, it could be next year, it could be the year after. At a guess, I think we've got a couple of years in the tank if all things, go well. There isn't, and by all things going well, I mean there isn't another, say, Southport scale attack, or there isn't yet another massive revelation or acceleration of public interest in the sexual torture networks, or some other kind of terrorist attack, or that inflames the situation. We're at a point now, moreover, that nobody's quite sure who's going to press that button first. Are we going to see another kind of Islamic-inspired attack, or indeed is the vaunted far-right radical going to be in the playing the initiating role? I don't know. I mean, as I said before, I think increasingly people want to fight, and at this point in the history of the world, like we're 25 years after the initiation of the war on terror, people understand how to take existing cleavages in society and pull them apart. These are techniques that we're familiar with because we've been observing them in other places of the world for a quarter of a century now. So it could be any time. but I think a couple of years is about right. I honestly think that the most cynical of our political leaders reckon there is a certain logic that says if you can accelerate things, I mean, if they can accelerate through this period, they can produce a society which is sufficiently fractured that actually this can't occur because of the coordination costs involved in getting very disparate groups. And there is a certain amount of logic to that. At a certain point, there's not going to be enough young-ish native people around to do very much. It'll be hard to pull off. I don't know where that might be. I'm at a guess. I think you're talking outer limit, maybe 10 to 15 years. Some people are more hopeful on that respect, but the really important numbers are youth. When you're thinking demographically, it's in youth demographics, and the trajectory is very obvious there. There's not a lot left. There's not a lot of time left on the clock if your concern is downgrading or is the effect of downgrading. And I think people's and the effect of people's increasing realization of that is to further increase their sense of urgency about acting. So, which inclined me to say that I don't see a really obvious off ramp, and I think it's probably closer than people think.
Mm-hmm. And if you had to pick a country, the reason I ask about the countries, the reason I ask that is because Europe is quite dense, especially compared to North America's in respect to borders. And I feel like whichever country does it first, a neighboring country will probably be second. So that's why I ask which country.
I don't really know because it's such a tight race. Yeah. You're looking at 100 meter, sprint here with the pack is all like they're practically on top of each other trying to get across the finish line first, if you get my analogy. And truthfully, I don't think it really matters for exactly the reason you said, because it'll spread. So it's not really a big prize if you get over the line first, and it's not really a consolation if you don't get over the line first, because it's probably going to happen to you anyway. But you asked the question anyway, so I'll give it a guess, and I think Ireland. I still think Ireland, on account of a couple of factors. Most obvious being that it has a fairly recent tradition of rebellion, and it has all of the things that I've talked about in Britain are factors which exist in Ireland, and to some degree probably in an even worse form. It's even more egregious. So, I'm inclined to Ireland, but I know I have a few Irish interlocutors who are actually kind of pessimistic on that point, that reckon that the Irish are now too far gone and too apathetic. But my gut feeling says Ireland.
Well, David, this has been a very enlightening conversation. I was looking forward to speaking with you for many weeks now. I want to thank you for coming on. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.